The evening air in Nashville was thick with the scent of summer and distant music, the kind of night that made dreams feel both impossibly close and heartbreakingly far. Grace Miller, 25. Moved with practiced grace through the softly lit dining room of Harmony, a restaurant known for its elegant ambience and the baby grand piano that stood sentinel near the bar. To most of the guests, Grace was simply another face in a crisp uniform, a polite smile paired with a steady hand balancing plates and glasses. But beneath the surface, she was a world apart, a young woman whose heart beat in time with melodies no one else could hear. Grace's story was one of quiet resilience. Raised in a small Tennessee town, she was the eldest daughter of a single mother who worked double shifts as a nurse to keep food on the table for Grace and her two younger siblings. Money was always tight, but music was a constant presence in their modest home. Her mother's battered cassette tapes and the old upright piano, a hand-me-down from a generous neighbor, became Grace's lifeline. While other children played outside, Grace sat at the piano, fingers dancing over chipped keys, coaxing out pop songs by ear before discovering the world of classical music through borrowed library books. Her talent blossomed in the most unlikely of places: school assemblies, church gatherings, and the annual county fair. Applause followed her, but so did the reality of their circumstances. The line between talent and opportunity was drawn in dollars and cents. By the time she graduated high school, it was clear that college and the conservatory she dreamed of would have to wait. Scholarships fell through. Bills piled up. Family came first. So, Grace folded her dreams away, telling herself it was only temporary, that someday she would return to the music that made her feel whole. Yet, the music never truly left her. It lived in the quiet moments, late at night after her shift, when the world was still and she could sit at her old piano, letting her worries melt into the keys. When she moved to Nashville, drawn by the city's reputation as a haven for dreamers, she took the job at Harmony not just for the paycheck, but for the piano that called to her from the corner of the dining room. She rarely had the chance to play it, but its presence grounded her, a silent promise that her dreams were not entirely out of reach. That night, as the dinner rush settled into a comfortable hum, the front doors swung open and in walked Carter Reynolds. He was unmistakable, young, sharply dressed, and radiating the kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. A tech billionaire with a reputation for drama and a taste for spectacle, Carter was trailed by a group of equally smug associates. The staff exchanged knowing glances. Carter was notorious for treating service as his personal stage. Grace, however, approached his table with the same calm professionalism she offered every guest. She took their orders, enduring Carter's loud jokes and offhand remarks about making it big in America, his voice carrying just enough to draw attention from nearby tables. To him, she was invisible, another cog in the machinery of his evening's entertainment. But something about Grace caught his eye. As she turned to leave, he called after her, squinting at her name tag. "Grace," he said, his tone playful but edged with something sharper. "That sounds like someone with a secret or two." She smiled politely, nodding, and continued on her way. She didn't see the sly smirk he exchanged with his friends, or the way his gaze lingered long after she'd gone. But Carter wasn't just watching, he was plotting. For him, the night was a game, and Grace was about to become the unwitting centerpiece. As the evening wore on, Carter's performance escalated. He regaled his table with exaggerated tales of success, peppered with thinly veiled jabs at people who never take risks. His friends laughed on cue, while other diners exchanged uneasy glances. Grace focused on her work, doing her best to avoid his attention, but when she returned with a bottle of wine, Carter seized the moment. "So tell me, Grace," he said, his voice slicing through the gentle din, "what do you really do when you're not serving tables? A woman like you must have a dream or two." The question caught her off guard. She hesitated, then replied quietly, "I play piano sometimes." Carter's eyes lit up with a spark of mischief. "A pianist? How charming. Why don't you treat us to a little concert?" Grace froze. The room seemed to pause with her. Conversations faded, and all eyes turned her way. She laughed nervously, trying to deflect. "I'm just here to work tonight." "Nonsense," Carter pressed, his voice booming. "The piano's right there. Surely someone with big dreams isn't afraid of a little audience." His friends snickered, clearly entertained, while Grace's chest tightened under the spotlight of their attention. She wanted to disappear, to melt into the background. But Carter's next words cut deeper than she expected. "All dreams, no courage." What a shame. The words stung, meant to diminish her, to make her small. In that moment, Grace heard her mother's voice in her mind. "Don't let anyone decide your worth for you. You are more than they'll ever see." A hush fell over the restaurant. Grace looked at the piano, then back at Carter, his smirk daring her to fold. Against every instinct urging her to stay invisible, she stepped forward. "Fine," she said, her voice steady. "I'll play." As she walked toward the piano, every step was a battle between fear and resolve. The room held its breath, waiting. Grace sat at the bench, her fingers trembling as they hovered above the keys. But as she closed her eyes and let the first notes ring out, the world faded away. In that moment, she wasn't just a waitress. She was herself, unapologetically, undeniably. Grace's feet felt heavier with every step toward the piano, but she refused to let her nerves show. The restaurant, moments ago alive with laughter and clinking glasses, had fallen into a hush so profound she could hear her own heartbeat. Carter Reynolds leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, a smug grin on his face, as if he'd already won some private wager. But Grace barely looked at him. She focused instead on the gleaming keys, the familiar scent of polished wood, the way the light pooled over the instrument like a spotlight waiting just for her. She sat down, exhaled slowly, and let her fingers hover above the keys. For a moment, she was back in her childhood living room, her mother humming along as she played, her siblings listening from the hallway. The memories steadied her hands. She chose a piece she knew by heart, one that had always been her refuge, Debussy's Clair de Lune. The first notes emerged soft and tentative, like a secret whispered into the dark. At first, there was only silence. Then, as the melody unfurled, something shifted in the air. Conversations faded. Forks were set down. Even Carter's friends, who had been snickering moments before, fell quiet. The music wrapped around the room, gentle but insistent, weaving through the tables and drawing every ear. Grace's confidence grew with each measure. Her hands moved with the ease of years spent practicing in the quiet hours after work, each chord a release of longing and hope. She poured herself into the performance, not just her skill, but her story, her sacrifices, her yearning for something more. The music became her voice, saying everything she'd never dared to say aloud. She was no longer just a waitress or a background presence. For these few minutes, she was undeniable, her talent impossible to ignore. By the time the last note faded, the restaurant was suspended in a breathless silence. Grace kept her hands on the keys, afraid to break the spell. Then, as if on cue, applause erupted. It was thunderous, genuine, and overwhelming. Some guests stood, clapping with a fervor that brought tears to her eyes. Her coworkers joined in, their faces lit with pride and surprise. Grace felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sense of belonging, of being seen for the first time in years. Carter's reaction was more complicated. His confident smirk had vanished, replaced by a blank, unsettled expression. He clapped, but the gesture was slow and hollow, his pride clearly bruised. The power dynamic had shifted. The room which had once revolved around his bravado, now centered on Grace's quiet strength. As Grace rose from the piano, her legs trembling but her posture tall, she glanced around the room. The admiration in the guests' eyes was real, not just polite. She offered a small, grateful smile to an elderly couple who had cheered the loudest, feeling for the first time that her music had truly reached someone. Carter tried to recover his composure, forcing a laugh. "Well," he said, his voice a little too loud for the lingering stillness. "That was unexpected. You never know where you'll find talent these days." His words fell flat, lacking the charm he usually wielded so easily. His friends exchanged awkward glances, unsure whether to join in or stay silent. Grace met Carter's gaze, her own steady and unyielding. "Thank you," she replied, her tone calm and measured. There was no anger, but no softness either. She had said everything she needed to say through her music. Carter shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that the spotlight had moved on. The rest of the evening unfolded in a new light. Diners who had witnessed the performance approached Grace with words of encouragement. An older woman squeezed her hand and whispered, "Don't ever stop playing." A man at the bar leaned over and said, "That was real. Don't let anyone dim that light." Each compliment was more than just polite. It was a validation, a reminder that her gift mattered. When Grace returned to Carter's table to deliver the check, his demeanor had changed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a grudging respect tinged with resentment. "You made your point," he muttered, barely meeting her eyes. "No need to drag it out." Grace's reply was quiet but firm. "It was never about making a point. I just wanted to play." The words hung between them, final and unassailable. Carter looked away, his bravado crumbling. As the night drew to a close, Carter and his entourage slipped out with none of their usual fanfare. The restaurant, still buzzing from Grace's performance, felt transformed. Her coworkers greeted her with proud smiles and gentle nods. She finished her shift with a renewed sense of purpose, her steps lighter, her spirit stronger. Later, as she walked home beneath the Nashville stars, Grace replayed the night in her mind. She realized she wasn't just a waitress with a hidden talent. She was a musician. And tonight, she had reclaimed her voice not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been told to stay small. That night, as she sat at her old upright piano in her modest apartment, Grace let her fingers wander over the keys. The music flowed, unburdened and free. Something fundamental had shifted inside her. Her talent was no longer something to hide or defend. It simply was. And that was enough. Word of her performance began to spread, turning into a quiet legend among the restaurant's regulars. Days later, Grace received a call from a local music producer who had been dining that night. He wasn't offering instant fame, but he was offering a chance, a studio session, a demo, a first step. Grace said yes. Not because she expected it to change her life overnight, but because it felt like a door opening at last. For the first time in years, she was ready to walk through it. The applause that had filled Harmony lingered in Grace's mind long after the last guest left. That night marked a turning point, not just for her, but for the entire restaurant. The energy that had once pulsed with exclusivity and hushed conversations now hummed with something deeper: respect, reflection, and the quiet awe that follows witnessing something genuine. Grace finished her shift with a new sense of purpose. Each table she visited, each plate she carried, felt lighter. Diners who had witnessed her performance paused her with words of encouragement. An older woman, eyes shining, pressed her hand gently and whispered, "You have a gift. Don't ever hide it." A man at the bar leaned in, his voice low but earnest. "That was real. Don't let anyone take that from you." These weren't just compliments, they were acknowledgments, small affirmations that her music had truly reached people. Yet not everyone was ready to let go of old habits. When Grace returned to Carter's table to deliver the check, his demeanor had shifted. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a tight, almost resentful expression. He glanced up, the corner of his mouth twitching as he muttered, "You made your point. No need to drag it out." Grace met his eyes, steady and unflinching. "It was never about making a point," she replied, her tone even. "I just wanted to play." There was nothing left for Carter to say. He looked away, fingers drumming nervously on his glass. The once commanding figure now diminished by the weight of his own actions. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Carter's friends, who had laughed at his jokes and echoed his bravado, now sat quietly, their eyes averted. The smug superiority that had filled their corner of the restaurant had evaporated, replaced by an uneasy silence. Grace's reply, calm and sincere, carried more weight than anything said all night. The room had seen through the facade, and Carter, for the first time, seemed to realize it. As the evening wound down, Grace's coworkers greeted her with soft smiles and quiet nods. She moved from table to table, not as someone performing for approval, but as someone who finally owned her space. The shift in her presence was subtle but unmistakable, her spine straighter, her eyes brighter, her confidence no longer something she had to summon, but something she simply carried. When the night ended, Carter and his entourage slipped out quietly, their usual dramatic exit replaced by a subdued, uneasy departure. Grace watched them go, feeling neither vindication nor resentment. She wasn't dwelling on Carter anymore. Her mind was already turning toward what might come next. That night, as she walked home beneath the Nashville stars, Grace felt lighter than she had in years. The tips she'd received were unusually generous, enough to cover her rent and leave a little extra, just enough to finally book those piano lessons she'd been putting off. But the real reward was the clarity she felt deep inside. She wasn't just a waitress, and she wasn't just someone who used to dream of something bigger. She was a musician. And nothing, not money, not arrogance, not fear, could take that truth away from her. At home, Grace sat at her old upright piano, its keys chipped and its sounds slightly muted. It didn't have the grandeur of the baby grand at Harmony, but it didn't need to. The music was still hers, flowing from the same place it always had, her heart. She played softly into the night, letting the melodies wash away the last traces of self-doubt. In the days that followed, her performance became something of a quiet legend among the restaurant's regulars. Diners who had been there retold the story of the waitress who silenced a billionaire with nothing but grace and music. Word began to spread, and just a few days later, Grace received a phone call. A local music producer who had been dining that night had tracked her down through the restaurant. He wasn't offering instant fame, but he was offering something real, studio time, a chance to record a demo, a first step. Grace said yes, not because she believed it would change everything overnight, but because it felt like a door cracking open. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid to walk through it. For years, Grace had let fear and self-doubt whisper that she wasn't ready, that her dreams were too far-fetched, that she would never be enough. But now, the truth stood before her, undeniable. Her resilience, her quiet authenticity, and her unwavering love for music were her greatest strengths. What happened with Carter hadn't just been a public humiliation flipped on its head, it was a revelation. Real power didn't come from money, bravado, or control. It came from refusing to shrink, from standing firm in her truth, from letting her passion speak louder than anyone's cynicism. Carter, with all his wealth and charm, could never take away what made her who she was. He was a symbol of every voice that had ever told her she couldn't or shouldn't, and she had silenced him not with anger, but with music. To anyone watching her story unfold, Grace's message was unmistakable: never let someone else define your worth. The world is full of Carters, people who mask their own insecurities by belittling others. But real strength is found in standing firm, letting your passion speak louder than their doubt. As she gently closed the piano lid and rested her fingers on the worn wood, Grace smiled. Her journey was far from over, but for the first time, it truly felt like it had begun. The days after Grace's performance at Harmony felt like waking up in a different world. The story of the waitress who silenced a billionaire with nothing but music spread quickly, first among the restaurant's regulars, then through whispered retellings, and finally, inevitably, online. Someone had recorded her performance, and within hours, the video was circulating on social media, drawing comments from strangers who saw in Grace not just a server, but an artist 123. At first, Grace was overwhelmed by the attention. Messages poured in, some from old friends, others from complete strangers, offering praise, encouragement, and even opportunities. Her coworkers looked at her with newfound respect, and regular customers greeted her with warm smiles and questions about her music. The tips grew larger, but more importantly, so did her sense of possibility. For years, she had moved through life quietly, her dreams folded away like old sheet music. Now, those dreams were stirring, insistent, and alive. Yet, with the excitement came anxiety. Grace wasn't used to being the center of attention. The idea of strangers dissecting her life was daunting, and the fear of not living up to their expectations gnawed at her. She clung to her routines, finding comfort in the familiar rhythm of work, home, and the old upright piano in her apartment. But the world kept nudging her forward. 3 days after her performance, Grace received a call that would change everything. The voice on the other end belonged to Marcus Evans, a local music producer who had been dining at Harmony that night. "I saw something special in you," he said, his tone warm but direct. "I think your music deserves to be heard. I'd like to offer you some studio time to record a demo, no strings attached. What do you say?" 2. Grace's heart pounded. She wanted to say yes immediately, but doubt crept in. Was she really ready? What if she failed? What if this was all just a fluke? She hesitated, asking Marcus for a day to think it over. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table, staring at the producer's business card. Her younger sister, Lily, noticed her distracted state and asked what was wrong. Grace explained, her voice trembling with uncertainty. Lily listened quietly, then squeezed Grace's hand. "You've spent your whole life putting others first. Maybe it's time to bet on yourself." "I know Mom would want that." Her sister's words echoed in Grace's mind. For years, she had convinced herself that her sacrifices were more important than her own happiness. But now, faced with a real chance to reclaim the life she once imagined, she realized that fear had been her greatest obstacle. Taking a deep breath, she picked up her phone and dialed Marcus's number. "I'd like to do it," she said. "I want to try." The next morning, Grace met Marcus at a small but well-equipped studio tucked away in a quiet part of the city. The walls were lined with vintage records, and the air was filled with the scent of coffee and possibility. Marcus greeted her with a reassuring smile. "This is your space," he said, gesturing toward the grand piano at the center of the room. "Play whatever feels right. Let's see where it takes us." 2. Grace sat at the piano, her nerves buzzing beneath the surface. She started with the piece she had played at Harmony, letting her fingers find their way through the familiar notes. Marcus listened intently, his expression shifting from curiosity to genuine awe. Encouraged, Grace experimented, blending classical motifs with the soulful improvisations she had developed over years of playing for herself. The music flowed, raw and unfiltered, capturing the struggles, hopes, and resilience that defined her journey. After hours of recording, Marcus leaned back, a satisfied smile on his face. "You've got it, Grace. You really do. This is just the beginning." Hearing those words ignited a flicker of hope in her heart. For the first time, She began to believe that her talent was more than just a remnant of her past. It was her future. As days turned into weeks, Grace balanced her shifts at Harmony with long hours in the studio. Marcus pushed her to refine her compositions and encouraged her to take creative risks. Together, they crafted a demo that captured the essence of her story: the struggle, the resilience, the triumph. The local buzz surrounding her viral video grew into something bigger. Music blogs and local news outlets picked up her story, dubbing her the Waitress with the golden touch. Invitations to perform at small venues began to pour in, but Grace hesitated, the fear of public failure still lingering. One evening, Marcus handed her an invitation to perform at the Nashville Rising Stars Showcase, a prestigious event known for launching the careers of new artists. "This is your moment," he told her. "You belong on that stage." His words were meant to inspire, but Grace couldn't ignore the knot of anxiety forming in her chest. She had spent years blending into the background. Stepping into the spotlight felt like stepping into a storm. That night, after a particularly grueling rehearsal, Grace found herself alone at the studio piano, staring at the keys. The excitement that had fueled her earlier was now replaced by exhaustion and doubt. She began to play, letting her emotions spill out in a quiet, improvised melody. As the music filled the empty room, she remembered the faces in the restaurant, the applause, her sister's faith in her, and Marcus's unwavering support. Slowly, the fear began to fade, replaced by a steady resolve. Grace realized that every step forward would bring new challenges, but also new opportunities. She didn't have to have all the answers. She just had to keep playing, keep believing, and keep choosing her dream, one note at a time. The door had opened. Now, it was up to her to walk through it. The weeks that followed Grace's first studio session were a whirlwind of new experiences, small victories, and unexpected setbacks. The world outside Harmony seemed to open up, offering glimpses of a future she'd barely dared to imagine. But as her dreams grew closer, so did her fears. Grace balanced her shifts at the restaurant with long nights in the studio, working with Marcus to shape the raw material of her life into music that felt honest and alive. The process was exhilarating but exhausting. For every moment of inspiration, there were hours of self-doubt. What if she wasn't good enough? What if this was all just a fleeting moment of luck? Each time she faltered, she remembered the applause at Harmony, the strangers who told her not to hide her light, and her sister's unwavering faith. Still, the pressure to prove herself, to her family, to Marcus, to the growing online audience, felt heavier than ever. The buzz around her viral video hadn't faded. Invitations to perform at open mics and small venues poured in, and local journalists reached out for interviews. Grace felt both grateful and overwhelmed. She wanted to seize every opportunity, but the fear of public failure lingered. The thought of letting down those who believed in her was almost paralyzing. One afternoon, as she was leaving the studio, Grace found Carter Reynolds waiting outside. He looked different, less polished, more subdued. Gone was the arrogant billionaire who had tried to make her the butt of a joke. In his place was someone quieter, almost vulnerable. "Grace," he began, awkwardly, "I owe you an apology. That night at Harmony, I was out of line. I thought I was being clever, but I was just cruel. You didn't deserve that." Grace was surprised by the sincerity in his voice. She nodded, accepting the apology, but didn't let him off the hook so easily. "Why did you do it?" she asked. Genuinely curious. Carter hesitated, then sighed. "I guess I wanted to feel powerful. I've spent my whole life trying to prove I belong at the top. Somewhere along the way, I forgot what it means to actually listen to people. Watching you play, seeing how you owned that moment, it made me realize how empty all of this can be if you're not real with yourself." The conversation lingered with Grace long after Carter left. She saw that even those who seemed to have everything could be lost, searching for meaning in all the wrong places. It was a reminder that everyone was fighting their own battles and that true strength came from authenticity, not bravado. As the date of the Nashville Rising Stars showcase approached, Grace's anxiety mounted. The event was a big deal. Industry professionals, journalists, and hundreds of music lovers would be in attendance. Marcus encouraged her, reminding her that she'd already proven herself where it mattered most, in front of people who didn't expect to be moved. But Grace couldn't shake the fear of failing on a bigger stage. The night before the showcase, she sat alone at her apartment piano, hands trembling above the keys. She thought of her mother, who had sacrificed so much, and her siblings, who looked up to her. She thought of Carter's apology, Marcus's belief in her, and the strangers who had cheered her on. Most of all, she thought of the girl she used to be, the one who played for herself, not for approval. Grace closed her eyes and began to play, letting her emotions spill into the music. She played not just for the showcase, but for every moment that had brought her here, the long shifts, the missed opportunities, the quiet victories. The music was raw, vulnerable, and true. The next evening, as she stepped onto the stage at the showcase, the familiar nerves returned. But this time, she welcomed them. They meant she cared. The lights were blinding, the room filled with expectant faces. Grace took a deep breath, found her place at the piano, and began to play. The first notes were tentative, but as she settled into the music, her confidence grew. She played a piece she had written herself, a blend of classical technique and soulful improvisation, a story told in melody. The audience was silent, hanging on every note. Grace poured her heart into the performance, unafraid to let her vulnerability show. When the final chord faded, there was a moment of perfect stillness. Then, the applause came, loud, genuine, and overwhelming. Grace stood, tears in her eyes, and took a bow. She had faced her real challenge, not the showcase, not Carter, not the expectations of others, but her own fear of being seen. After the show, Marcus hugged her, beaming with pride. "You did it, Grace. You really did it." Journalists approached her. Fans asked for autographs, and even a few industry insiders expressed interest in her music. But the most meaningful moment came when she spotted Carter in the crowd, clapping earnestly, a look of genuine respect on his face. Grace realized that success wasn't about perfection or fame. It was about showing up, taking risks, and refusing to let fear dictate the terms of her life. She had learned that obstacles were not roadblocks, but invitations to grow one. And as she left the stage, she knew that whatever came next, she was ready to meet it, one note at a time. Grace's performance at the Nashville Rising Stars showcase marked a new chapter, but it was the days that followed that truly tested her resolve. The applause from that night still echoed in her memory, yet the real world pressed in with new challenges and unexpected opportunities. She found herself living in a strange in-between. No longer anonymous, not yet a star, but undeniably changed. Her story began to circulate beyond the showcase. Local journalists covered the waitress who silenced a billionaire with music, and the viral video from Harmony continued to gain traction. Grace received messages from aspiring musicians, single mothers, and young dreamers, people who saw themselves in her journey and found hope in her courage. For the first time, she realized that her story was bigger than herself. She wasn't just playing for her own healing anymore. She was inspiring others to believe in their worth and their dreams won. With the newfound attention came new pressures. Invitations to perform arrived from venues she'd only ever admired from afar. Her schedule filled with interviews, rehearsals, and meetings with industry professionals. Each opportunity was a gift, but also a test of her stamina and authenticity. Grace was determined not to lose herself in the whirlwind. She remembered the advice of those who had mentored her. Success wasn't about chasing fame, but about staying true to the music and the message within too. There were moments of doubt. The music industry, she quickly learned, could be as fickle and demanding as any other. She faced criticism, comparisons, and the constant pressure to be marketable. But Grace drew strength from her roots, the sacrifices her mother made, the lessons learned in late-night practice sessions, and the quiet power of vulnerability. She poured these truths into her songwriting, crafting melodies that spoke to struggle, hope, and the quiet triumphs that often go unnoticed. One afternoon, Grace received an unexpected visit at the studio. Carter Reynolds, the billionaire whose challenge had sparked her journey, arrived unannounced. He was different, less guarded, more sincere. Carter apologized again, this time not just for his behavior, but for the culture he had helped perpetuate, one that equated worth with wealth and power with volume. He confessed that seeing Grace stand her ground had forced him to reflect on his own values and the emptiness of success without meaning. Their conversation was honest, sometimes uncomfortable, but ultimately healing. Carter offered to support Grace's community work, helping provide music lessons to underprivileged youth. Grace accepted, not as charity, but as a partnership built on mutual respect. Their story, once one of conflict, became a testament to growth, forgiveness, and the possibility of change. As Grace's career blossomed, she made a point to stay connected to her beginnings. She continued working with Marcus, her producer, but also mentored young musicians, sharing her experiences and encouraging them to find their own voices. She performed at charity events, visited schools, and never missed Sunday dinners with her family. Fame, she realized, was fleeting. What mattered was the impact she could have, one song, one story, one person at a time too. The music itself evolved. Grace experimented with new genres, collaborated with local artists, and wrote songs that reflected her journey. Her debut EP, recorded in the same studio where she'd first found her confidence, was a tapestry of resilience and hope. Critics praised her authenticity, and fans connected deeply with her message. Grace's performances became known not just for technical brilliance, but for the emotional honesty that left audiences moved and inspired. But perhaps the greatest change was internal. Grace no longer measured her worth by applause or headlines. She understood now that real power came from integrity, from refusing to shrink, from letting her passion speak louder than anyone's cynicism. She had learned, through hardship and triumph alike, that her story was not unique. Every person carried dreams, fears, and the potential for greatness. Her role was simply to remind them, through music and example, that they mattered. One evening, after a particularly moving concert, Grace sat alone at her old upright piano. The room was quiet, the city lights flickering beyond the window. She played softly, letting the music carry her back through every step of her journey. The sacrifices, the humiliation, the risk, the applause, and the healing. She realized that each note was a thread in the fabric of her life, a life defined not by perfection, but by courage and connection. As she closed the piano lid, Grace smiled, knowing her journey was far from over. There would be new challenges, new stages, and new stories to tell. But she was ready. She had found her voice, and through it, she would continue to inspire others to find theirs. Her story was no longer just about a waitress, a billionaire, and a grand piano. It was about the quiet strength that lives in all of us and the music we create when we choose to let it be heard. Grace's world had changed, but the transformation was not without its own turbulence. The days after her showcase performance were a blur of new opportunities and unfamiliar pressures. She was no longer just a waitress with a hidden gift. She was a musician on the cusp of something bigger, and everyone seemed to have an opinion about what she should do next. The invitations kept coming, local television interviews, requests to perform at charity galas, messages from music lovers across the country who had seen the viral video and found something of themselves in her story. Grace was grateful. But she also felt the weight of expectation settling on her shoulders. The attention was flattering, but it was also relentless. For every word of encouragement, there was a voice of doubt. A reminder that the world could be fickle, that fame was fleeting. Still, Grace pressed forward. She split her days between her shifts at Harmony and long hours in the studio with Marcus, working on her first EP. The songs were a tapestry of her journey, pieces about sacrifice, hope, and the quiet power of perseverance. Marcus pushed her to dig deeper, to write not just for herself, but for the people who needed her story. "You're not just telling your truth," he reminded her. "You're giving others permission to find theirs." But with each new step, Grace faced new challenges. The music industry was more complicated than she'd imagined. Producers wanted to shape her image, to smooth out her rough edges, to make her more marketable. Grace resisted, determined to stay true to her roots, but the pressure was real. She worried about disappointing Marcus, her family, and her growing audience. She worried about losing herself in the noise. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day of meetings and rehearsals, Grace found herself alone in the studio. The city lights glimmered outside, and the silence felt heavy. She sat at the piano, her hands hovering over the keys, but for the first time in months, the music didn't come easily. Doubt crept in, whispering that maybe she wasn't cut out for this. That maybe she was just a waitress who got lucky. As she sat there, her phone buzzed, a message from Carter Reynolds. The billionaire who had once tried to humiliate her had become an unexpected source of support. He had kept his promise to help fund music programs for underprivileged youth. And their conversations had grown into a kind of friendship. "Don't let them change you," his message read. "The world needs your voice, not another imitation." Grace smiled, the tension in her shoulders easing. She thought about her mother's sacrifices, her sister's encouragement, the strangers who had seen her, really seen her, for the first time. She remembered the night at Harmony, the hush before her first note, the applause that had wrapped around her like a promise. Taking a deep breath, Grace let her fingers find the keys. She played not for the industry, not for the critics, but for herself, for the girl who had dreamed by the light of a battered piano, for the woman who had learned to stand tall in the face of ridicule. The music flowed, raw and unfiltered, a reminder that her power came not from perfection, but from authenticity. The next day, Grace met with Marcus and laid out her vision for the EP. "I want this to be honest," she said. "I want people to hear the struggle, the hope, the truth." Marcus nodded, pride shining in his eyes. "That's what makes you special, Grace. Don't ever lose it." As the EP neared completion, Grace was invited to perform at a nationally televised benefit concert. It was her biggest stage yet, and the nerves returned in full force. She worried about making mistakes, about being judged, about not living up to the moment. But as she stepped onto the stage, the lights blinding and the audience a sea of expectant faces, she remembered Carter's words, Marcus's faith, her own journey. She sat at the grand piano, closed her eyes, and let the music speak. The performance was not flawless. There were missed notes, moments of hesitation, but it was real. The audience responded with a standing ovation, and Grace felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had faced her real test, not the scrutiny of others, but the challenge of remaining true to herself. After the concert, Grace received messages from viewers who had been moved by her performance. Some shared their own stories of struggle and hope. Others simply thanked her for reminding them that dreams were worth fighting for. Grace realized that her journey was not just about music or recognition. It was about connection, about inspiring others to find their own courage. As she walked home that night, Grace felt lighter. The road ahead would not be easy, but she was no longer afraid. She had learned that the real test was not about applause or approval, but about choosing to be herself, again and again. No matter who was watching. Her story was still unfolding, but one thing was clear. Grace's music would always be a testament to the quiet strength that lives in every person who dares to dream. The weeks raced by as Grace prepared for the biggest night of her life, her debut at the Nashville Rising Stars Gala. The city buzzed with anticipation, and for the first time, she wasn't just a face in the crowd, she was the main event. Her story had spread far beyond Harmony and the viral video. Now, music lovers, local press, and even a few industry insiders wanted to see if the waitress-turned pianist could truly command a stage. Grace's nerves simmered beneath the surface. She spent long hours rehearsing with Marcus, perfecting her set list and working on a new original piece, a song that wove together the struggles, hopes, and quiet victories of her journey. She wanted her music to be more than entertainment. She wanted it to be a message, a testament to everyone who had ever felt invisible or unheard. The night of the gala arrived, and the concert hall glowed with golden light. Grace stood backstage in a simple black dress, her hands trembling as she listened to the muffled sounds of the gathering audience. She thought of her mother, her siblings, the friends who had supported her, and even Carter, whose unexpected apology and support had helped her see that people could change. She remembered every late-night practice, every moment of doubt, every time she'd chosen courage over comfort. When her name was announced, the applause was thunderous. Grace walked out, heart-pounding, and took her place at the grand piano center stage. The lights dimmed, and for a moment there was only silence. She closed her eyes, drew a steadying breath, and began to play. The first notes were soft and searching, like the beginning of a story. As the melody unfolded, Grace poured her heart into the music, her sacrifices, her longing, her resilience. The piece built slowly, drawing the audience in until the room felt suspended in time. Each chord was a declaration. I am here. I am enough. I will not shrink. As she played, Grace felt the old fears melt away. She was no longer performing for approval. She was sharing her truth. The music swelled, bold and luminous, and the audience was transfixed. Some closed their eyes, letting the sound wash over them. Others sat forward, tears shining in their eyes. In that moment, Grace's journey belonged to everyone in the room. When the final note faded, there was a heartbeat of perfect stillness. Then the applause erupted louder, more heartfelt than anything she'd ever experienced. People stood, clapping and cheering, some calling her name. Grace stood, blinking back tears, and took a deep bow. Backstage, Marcus hugged her tightly. You did it, Grace. You showed them who you are. Reporters clamored for interviews, fans asked for autographs, and fellow musicians congratulated her. But the most meaningful moment came when she spotted her family in the front row, her mother beaming with pride, her siblings waving excitedly. Even Carter was there, standing in the wings, applauding with genuine respect. The aftermath of the gala was a whirlwind. Offers came in for recording contracts, festival appearances, and collaborations. But Grace moved carefully, determined to stay true to her values and her music. She worked with Marcus to select opportunities that aligned with her vision, projects that prioritized authenticity and community over fame and fortune. Her story continued to inspire. She received letters from young musicians, single parents, and dreamers of all ages who saw themselves in her journey. Grace responded to as many as she could, sharing encouragement and advice. She began volunteering with local music programs, mentoring aspiring artists and helping them find their voices. The transformation was not just public, but deeply personal. Grace no longer measured her worth by applause or headlines. She understood now that true success was about impact, about using her gifts to lift others up, to remind them of their own strength and possibility. Her music evolved, blending genres and influences, always rooted in honesty and hope. One evening, after a particularly moving performance at a community benefit, Grace sat alone at her old upright piano. The city lights shimmered outside her window, and the room was filled with a quiet peace. She played softly, letting the music carry her back through every step of her journey, the humiliation, the risk, the applause, and the healing. She realized that each note was a thread in the tapestry of her life, a life defined not by perfection, but by courage and connection. As she closed the piano lid, Grace smiled, knowing her journey was far from over. There would be new challenges, new stages, and new stories to tell. But she was ready. She had found her voice, and through it, she would continue to inspire others to find theirs. Her story was no longer just about a waitress, a grand piano, and a billionaire's challenge. It was about the quiet strength that lives in all of us and the music we create when we choose to let it be heard. The legend of that night at Bellamy's grew with each retelling. Emily's performance had not only changed the mood of an elegant Charleston bistro, it had altered the course of her own life and left a ripple in the hearts of everyone who witnessed it. What had begun as a smug attempt at public humiliation by Harrison Tate ended up as a moment of raw, transformative power, one that could not be bought or dismissed. In the days that followed, the story of the waitress who silenced a billionaire with music spread quickly. Regular diners recounted every detail, the hush that fell over the room, the way Emily's hands trembled at first, the way the music grew bolder with each measure. Her coworkers, once casual acquaintances, now looked at her with pride and a sense of camaraderie, quietly inspired by her courage. Even those who had laughed at Harrison's jokes found themselves reflecting on what they'd witnessed. The restaurant, once a stage for the wealthy and powerful, now felt like a place where something real had happened, a reminder that true worth isn't measured in dollars or bravado, but in the willingness to stand tall and let your voice be heard. Emily herself felt the change most profoundly. The generous tips that night were enough to cover her rent and finally book the piano lessons she'd been putting off. But the real shift was internal. For the first time in years, she didn't see herself as someone who had given up on her dreams. She was a musician, and nothing, not humiliation, not financial pressure, not fear, could take that away from her. The old upright piano in her modest apartment, with its chipped keys and muted sound, became her sanctuary once again. Each night, she played not for anyone's approval, but for the sheer joy of reclaiming her own story. The story didn't end there. Word of her performance reached a music producer visiting from Atlanta, who had been dining at Bellamy's that fateful evening. He tracked her down through the restaurant, offering her a chance to record a demo in his studio. Emily said yes, not because she believed it would change everything overnight, but because it felt like a door finally opening. For years, she had let fear and self-doubt whisper that she wasn't ready, that her dreams were too far-fetched. Now she saw the truth. Her quiet authenticity and resilience were her greatest strengths. The humiliation she'd endured had not broken her, it had revealed her true power. As she moved forward, Emily's message became clear to everyone who heard her story. Never let someone else define your worth. The world is full of people like Harrison, those who mask their own insecurities by belittling others. But real strength is found in standing firm in your truth, letting your passion speak louder than cynicism or doubt. Emily's journey was no longer just about a waitress, a grand piano, and a billionaire's challenge. It was about the quiet strength that lives in all of us and the music we create when we choose to let it be heard. Late one night, after a long shift and another session at the piano, Emily closed the lid and rested her hands on the worn wood. She smiled, feeling lighter and stronger than she had in years. Her journey was far from over, but for the first time, it truly felt like it had begun. She knew there would be more challenges, more moments of doubt, But she also knew she would face them with the same resolve that had carried her through that unforgettable night. So, what about you? What dream have you been pushing aside because fear told you to wait? Don't let the world's noise drown out your own voice. Don't wait for a moment like Emily's. Create your own. Let your passion speak. Let your story unfold. And remember, the next story of quiet strength and unexpected triumph could be yours.